Forget the perfect paintings and the colorful stained glass windows of churches for a moment. Today, we are not going to analyze a spiritual event or a founding myth. We are going to conduct a forensic analysis of a crime of state. What happened in the province of Judea more than 2,000 years ago was not merely an execution, it was the greatest documented judicial failure in ancient history. And understanding the cold, hard facts of that night, paradoxically, makes the story of the man who changed the world infinitely more human, more painful, and far more real. To understand what happened, we must first strip the scene of all dogma and look at the legal structure of the time. The Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish court, was known for an extremely rigorous penal code. They had sacred rules to ensure that an innocent person would never be condemned. These were laws made to protect life. But on that night, in a sequence of events that defies any logic of justice, exactly 18 procedural rules were ignored. The first and most glaring violation was the timing. Jewish law strictly prohibited capital sentencing trials from taking place at night. Night was for sleep, for family, for rest. The defendant was arrested in the dead of night, tried in darkness, and condemned before the sun had even risen. Why the rush? The rush is the first sign that justice is not being served, but rather carried out on command. The second colossal failure was the location. The court only had legal authority if it was convened at the temple, specifically in the chamber of hewn stone. But that night, the trial was held at the house of the high priest, Caiaphas. It was a clandestine tribunal, a closed-door proceeding, far from the eyes of the law and far from any transparency. And when we examine the witness stand, the situation only worsens. The law required 2 independent witnesses to tell the same account, with precise details. If there was a single contradiction, the case was immediately dismissed. The historical records show us that the witnesses brought against him contradicted each other constantly. And what did the tribunal do? It ignored the contradictions. When the system realized that the charge of religious blasphemy would not carry enough weight to convince the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, they committed the final fraud. They changed the classification of the crime. They transformed a theological accusation into a political act of treason. They claimed he was defying Caesar. They played on Roman politics to force the governor's hand. Pilate, a man who wanted no trouble, looked at that quiet man and found no crime whatsoever. He tried to wash his hands of it, but history does not forgive omission. By yielding to the crowd, the state sealed the fate of a man who, up to that moment, had only ever preached compassion. Throughout this entire process of manipulation, Jesus maintained a silence that, viewed today, seems even more striking. It was not the silence of someone with no defense. It was the silence of someone who knew that human justice was already dead. And it is in that silence, in that painful acceptance, that his humanity reveals itself. He was a man, in that moment, alone against a system that had already decided his end. As the sun began to rise over Jerusalem, the condemnation was already written. What the Roman Empire would do next would not merely be the execution of a man. It would push physical resistance and human dignity to a limit that modern forensic medicine can barely describe without sending a chill down the spine. Roman flagellation was not a punishment designed to teach a lesson. It was a tissue destruction technique engineered to bring the human body to the very edge of endurance before the final execution. Picture a short wooden handle. Attached to it, several strips of tough leather. At the tip of each strip, lead spheres for weight, and embedded within them, shards of sheep bone or sharp glass. When the Roman soldier delivered the blow, the lead spheres caused deep contusions, crushing the capillary vessels beneath the skin. Then the bone and glass shards grabbed the dermis and epidermis. When the soldier pulled the whip back, he was not merely striking, he was tearing. The skin was laid open, and the underlying musculature began to split apart. We are not talking about simple lacerations. We are talking about muscle tissue being exposed to the cold air, veins and arteries cut open and pouring blood. With each repeated blow, the anatomy of the back is literally transformed into ribbons. And this is where forensic medicine identifies the onset of collapse. Hypovolemic shock. Hypo means low. Volemic refers to volume. The body loses so much blood so rapidly that the heart goes into a panic. It begins to race desperately, trying to pump whatever blood remains to the vital organs. The brain, deprived of oxygen, begins to drift between consciousness and a twilight state. The victim feels an uncontrollable thirst. The body screams for fluids it no longer has. This is why, when he was made to walk toward the site of execution, his body gave way. It was not weakness of spirit, it was hemodynamic failure. The kidneys were already shutting down, unable to process the toxins generated by traumatic stress. The heart was in severe tachycardia. The central nervous system was flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. When he fell while carrying the horizontal crossbeam, weighing between 30 and 40 kilograms across wounds of exposed flesh, his body was, technically, living on borrowed time. And as the crowd watched, they saw a man being defeated by the weight of the wood. But anatomy tells us a far crueler story. They were witnessing a biological system in total collapse. The weight he carried was not only that of the cross, it was the weight of a body that no longer had enough blood to maintain the arterial pressure needed to remain standing. And the journey to the top of the hill was only the warm-up for what the physics of execution would demand from a body already nearly drained of life. No one survives a flagrum toxulatum and walks to be crucified out of sheer will. They survived because the willpower of the human nervous system is the last thing to surrender, even when the heart is already begging for final rest. What came next, at the top of that hill, defies not only biology, but the very logic of what a human being can endure before the system shuts down completely. Crucifixion was invented by the Persians to punish crimes of state, but it was the Romans who perfected it as a machine of slow torture. They did not want merely death, they wanted the prolongation of suffering. When the condemned arrived at the top of the hill, he was not tied down, he was stretched out. Picture the scene. The man is laid on the packed earth. The heavy, rough wooden beams form the instrument that will define his final breaths. The Roman nails were not ordinary nails. They were iron spikes, 15 to 18 centimeters long. And here lies a technical detail that most people overlook. They were not driven through the palms of the hands. The palm of the hand cannot bear the weight of an adult body. The flesh would tear and the body would fall. The nails were driven through the wrists, precisely between the carpal bones. And it is at this moment that the science of torture reaches its neurological apex. As the iron nail pierced the wrist, it crushed and compressed the median nerve. Think of that excruciating electric shock you feel when you strike your elbow against the corner of a table. Now multiply that by 1,000 and imagine that pain being pressed against raw iron with every single breath. The body is raised. The feet are nailed together in a position that forces the condemned into an unnatural posture. And then, the physics of execution begin to work against the prisoner himself. The greatest problem for someone being crucified is not the bleeding from the flagellation. The problem is the mechanics of breathing. When the body hangs from outstretched arms, the diaphragm is pulled downward, creating a forced expansion of the lungs. The condemned can inhale. He draws air in without great difficulty. The true horror is the exhalation. To release the air and avoid suffocating, the human body must contract the diaphragm. But on the cross, to do so, the victim must push themselves upward. They must lift their entire body weight using only the nails driven through their feet. The impulse to breathe becomes an act of absolute torture. He inhales and feels the air burn. To exhale, he pushes his body upward against the nails in his feet. The flesh of the feet tears against the iron. The median nerve in the wrists suffers agonizing friction. He releases the air, and the pain is so unbearable that he collapses downward again, returning to the initial position of asphyxiation. It is a vicious and macabre cycle. Inhale, push against the nails, exhale, collapse again. Oxygen does not circulate. Carbon dioxide accumulates in the bloodstream. Carbonic acid levels rise to toxic thresholds. This causes severe muscle cramps, uncontrollable spasms throughout the entire body. a sensation of every muscle being wrung from within. The heart begins to fight a battle it cannot win. Fluid begins to accumulate around the pericardium, the membrane encasing the heart, and also in the lungs, making each attempt to breathe a near impossible effort. The silence at the top of that hill was broken only by the sound of someone desperately and repeatedly trying to steal one last centimeter of air. There was no glory there. There was only human biology struggling to keep the flame of life burning, even as every law of physics and Roman torture declared that the system should have shut down long ago. That man was not simply dying. He was being dismantled, system by system, in a struggle that lasted for hours beneath the scorching sun of Judea. A moment arrives when the leg muscles simply no longer respond. The cycle of pain, inhalation, exhaustion, and asphyxiation reaches a threshold the human body was never designed to cross. The condemned no longer has the strength to lift their own weight and release the air. Oxygen in the blood drops to minimal levels, while carbon dioxide floods every cell. It is the moment when asphyxiation ceases to be a struggle and becomes the inevitable outcome. Modern forensic medicine understands what happens inside the thoracic cavity in those final hours. The chronic cardiac strain caused by the repeated effort of rising and falling causes the pericardium, that membrane protecting the heart, to fill with fluid. The same occurs in the pleurae, which surround the lungs. The cardiovascular system collapses. Blood, once vital, becomes a heavy burden the heart can no longer move. When the biblical accounts describe how, upon being pierced by a lance in the right side, blood and water flowed out, they were not describing a mystical miracle, but a biological phenomenon recorded with surgical precision by witnesses who had no understanding of anatomy. The Roman soldier's lance pierced the right lung and struck the pericardium, releasing the serous fluid accumulated through shock and prolonged asphyxiation, followed by blood that had already grown stagnant. It was the final proof, the confirmation that the system had shut down. But as we look at this outcome, we must return to the legal question that opened this analysis. 18 laws were broken. A man was condemned for a crime he did not commit, through a trial that respected not a single rule of the time, executed by one of the most cruel forms of torture that human ingenuity has ever produced. And all of this for a purely political reason, to maintain the order of an empire that saw in any movement of compassion a threat to its domination. The execution of Jesus was not merely the end of a life. It was a portrait of how systems, whether judicial, political, or social, can become blind machines when fear and power override justice and humanity. The man on the cross was not overcome by his enemies. He was taken to the final frontier of biological resistance by a system that feared what he represented. It is easy to look at history and see only the myth or the dogma, but when you lift the veil and analyze the evidence, the chronicle of events, and the anatomy of that suffering, you find something far more unsettling. You find a human being of flesh and blood who paid the ultimate price for remaining true to his mission in a world that had no place for him. If the theoretical, medical, and investigative truth shocks you more than the comfortable stories that are usually told out there, then you have understood the purpose of this analysis. Here, we do not seek the comfort of legend. We seek the hardness of fact. History does not change. What changes is how we choose to see it.